Hello and welcome again to another edition of Lost in Science across Australia on the Community Radio Network. My name's Stu, and on the show this week I'm going to talk about whether cheese is as addictive as crack.
When it comes to my own experience, I would say that yes, it is.
Well, look, there's a story going around in the mainstream media at the moment saying, yes, science has proven that cheese is addictive and you're all vindicated. But I'm going to look at what the actual study says, and we can talk about what that really means a little bit later in the show. Claire, what have you got for us?
Well, I'm actually going to look into the science of your siblings and how your personality is shaped by the siblings that you have and where you sit in your family. So if you're the eldest, middle, the youngest. And some new research that's come out this week to actually shed some light on whether it has any effect at all on your personality.
Okay, and Chris is talking to Maura O'Connor, who is the author of a book called Resurrection Science, which is all about the ethics of de-extinctifying animals and plants and things, and whether we should do it even if we can do it. Anyway, more about that later in the show. Stay tuned. Across Australia on the Community Radio Network, you're listening to Lost in Science. So I've noticed a story doing the rounds lately. A lot of newspapers and online media outlets have picked this up, saying that people who say they're addicted to cheese are vindicated because science has proven that
Cheese is addictive?
Cheese is addictive.
Yes!
So they say. And, some of them have even got crazy headlines, and saying that cheese is like crack. So... in answer to the question, is cheese like crack? No.
Oh.
It's absolutely nothing like crack, which is addictive, but in a completely different way, completely different mechanism, whatever, blah, blah, blah. It does have some similarities, but quite simply, despite all these articles, it's not really like crack cocaine because that's an addictive drug. It's quite a different thing. The other thing is we need to eat, so we might as well eat things that we like. And cheese is something that people like. But the reasons people seem to get addicted to cheese and have these addictive behaviours is the subject of a recent study from the University of Michigan in the United States. And they're investigating the hypothesis that certain types of processed foods could trigger addictive behaviour in humans. And they'd observed, in previous studies, people had observed that, rodents can exhibit addictive behaviour in response to
with like chocolate or...
Yeah, certain kinds of
that
foods.
Sort of thing.
So the study took 120 students and got them to fill in the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which is a survey designed to identify people who exhibit dependence on certain foods. And then in a second part of the study, 384 participants were given a forced choice exercise, which is when they have to choose one thing over another thing. And they were using selected foods that they identified in the first study. So the first study, people said, here's the food we most can't, that we can't stop eating, basically. And in the second study, they were given the choice between various of these combinations of these foods. So what they found was that processed foods were preferred by most people over unprocessed foods in terms of not being able to stop eating them. Regardless of whether the unprocessed food had the same or higher levels of fats or carbohydrates.
Right.
So it's actually the concentration, I guess, of the fats and carbohydrates in the processed food.
And by processed foods, you're talking...
We're talking white flour, white sugar, processed
So cheese
fats.
is a processed food
Cheese
in that...
is definitely a processed food.
Yeah,
It's got a lot of liquid taken out of it, for example, so you're left with a lot of milk fat and
And anything that's had like had microbes sort of treated in a certain way, like
Well,
cheese
even if you just even without the microbial activity,
yep.
if you just get literally the curds and whey, you separate the whey out from the milk, and what you're left with is the curds, which is all milk fat and milk sugars and all that stuff. So that's that's a process in itself. Yeah. So they propose the reason for this, that processed foods have higher rates of absorption by the body. So the delivery of fats or carbs, especially sugars, is much faster. So you basically, processing the food concentrates it and makes it easier to digest. So you get this rapid hit of fat or sugar, depending on what you're eating.
Delicious hit.
So it's the rapid absorption that's believed to be linked to the apparently addictive behaviours related to certain foods, combined with the high doses of sugars and fats in relatively small amounts of these foods. So the paper is called Which Foods May Be Addictive? The Roles of Processing Fat Content and Glycemic Load. And it was published in February in the online journal PLOS One. So the fact that it's only getting, into the mainstream media now means it's sort of filtered down through a number of layers of...
It's being processed it's being processed itself.
Yeah, it has been processed and concentrated to the point where I guess the headlines are probably a bit misleading.
Imagine that, a misleading headline of a scientific article.
No, I know that never happens, right? So one of the authors of the paper, Nicole Avena, said that the findings may help change the way we approach obesity treatment. May not be a simple matter of cutting back on certain foods, but rather adopting methods used to curtail smoking, drinking, and drug use. So she's actually saying, that the strategies for just just reduce, limit the amount you have is actually maybe we'd be better off using the same sort of, you should just quit that food, or you should just, quit eating those things.
Yeah, cold turkey. On processed turkey.
Yeah, so, I'm sort of wondering if that could mean warning signs on cheese and lollies. Obviously, more work is needed in this area to identify, actual biological mechanisms, because these are psychological findings. So this was a psychology study. All of the authors were psychologists, and it was basically sort of self-reporting. So there's no... long-term behavioural studies associated with this, no biochemical work to back it up at this point. So we'd really want to do all that sort of stuff before anyone made any serious policy decisions about those sorts of restrictions on these foods. One interesting thing the authors did mention was that potentially restricting marketing of these apparently addictive foods to children might be a good place to start, so that just the same as we don't let people sell cigarettes and alcohol to children, maybe we should not let people sell highly addictive foods. But, the jury's still out on whether we should be calling these behaviours addiction or whether or not, it's compulsive behaviour or some other kind of psychological mindset, I guess.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last bit. All I want is a wheel of cheese right now. If that's not addiction, then yeah.
You just mention it, and you just can't take your mind off it.
My mind's gone, Stu.
I'm Maggie Adair Pocock, and you're listening to Lost in Science on 3CR.
Stu, let me ask you a question. What's your birth number?
I'm number 3 of 4.
So you're
Makes
somewhere...
me sound like a Borg. Yeah. 3 of 4.
So you're somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I have my oldest sibling is a sister, my older brother, and then there's a younger sister as well. So
that's evenly distributed between
the
two sexes.
Yeah.
Yep. How do you think this has affected your personality, or has it at all?
Well, actually, us third children of four get together and have these conferences, and I've found that I fit in quite well with those people.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, I sort of feel the same. So I'm the youngest in my family, and as the youngest, people normally attribute me certain characteristics based on the fact that I was born last and I'm the youngest. Apparently, this makes me more agreeable, changeable, fun-loving, whereas my oldest sibling is more likely to be driven and ambitious, hardworking, and show neurotic tendencies.
Interesting,
yeah. Well, new research has come out that provides evidence showing that birth order doesn't actually affect your personality at all, meaning everyone who said I was fun-loving was wrong.
Yeah, well, that's quite clear. It's quite clear to all of us in the studio. That's just not true.
That is not true.
No.
Yeah. No more assumptions
So
based on the fact that I am the youngest child. But before I explain the new research, I'll give you a bit of a background. So all the assumptions that your personality is shaped partially by your birth order go back to a couple of 20th century psychologists. Alfred Adler was an Austrian psychologist. He was around the same time as Jung and Freud, and he came up with the idea of personality affecting, or birth order, I should say, affecting personality. And specifically that eldest children were dethroned when a second child was born. So by dethroned, I mean they had to share their parents' attention. They had to share the limelight. Most eldest children don't like doing that, and that has a lasting influence on them.
I'd have to say, just from, just common sense would say no children like doing that. It doesn't matter if you're the third children and then another one comes along. You're going to be upset that suddenly there's someone else taking your limelight.
Imagine if you were the first and you had everything.
Well, that's true.
And then someone comes along and you got to share it all. That is tough. That is tough.
Yeah, I guess, it's a diminishing returns. It's like you go from a whole to a half. Yeah. But, if you're the second child, it's like, well, I've only got half and I'm only losing. And then it's a third. And a third is,
Yeah.
You're losing less.
You're losing less each child. That's right. That's right. So after Adler, a guy named Frank Sulloway wrote a book that claimed that the big 5 personality traits, so openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, as well as neuroticism, are influenced and driven by birth order. So this was pretty controversial in psychological circles, but had a great deal of support in society and just in the with the general public. People really like this idea. I don't know, maybe it's because we like to feel like we have a tribe of people, like you were saying. You go to the conference of the third born of 4. I don't know, but everyone seems to have latched onto this idea that somehow we're all intrinsically similar if we have the same birth order, I guess, as others.
It's a form of pattern seeking that is very common to humans, and it kind of reminds me of the idea of horoscopes and astrology. In that people go, oh well, I can see all of these character traits in myself, therefore it makes sense that I'm an Aries or whatever it might be. Yeah. When in actual fact, most people have most character traits to more or less degree, and you just sort of, if you're looking for them, you'll find them.
That's right.
And if you've got a template of boxes to tick, then you say, oh yeah, I'm like that.
And if those boxes are fairly varied, then it means that the chances are high that at least one of them's going to be there, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a continuum too. It's like, oh yeah, well I'm very organised. And it's like, well, you're not that organised, but you're more organised than someone who's less organised than you, I guess. Yes. But it's just yeah. If you look for something, you'll find it in most people.
Exactly. So last week, a new paper was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science by German researchers, which pretty much found that there is no evidence that such a thing as a typical eldest child, middle child, or youngest child exists in terms of personality types. So these researchers analysed 20,000 people. So 20,000 siblings across 3 countries. They were looking at Germany, the UK and the US. And it was actually the biggest and most comprehensive analysis of birth order and personality to date. And they found that birth order had no effect on those 5 key personality traits that I mentioned before, which is a pretty big blow to the idea that it does affect personality. And a pretty big idea to a pretty big blow to, I guess, what the general public sort of believe in terms of eldest children having one sort of personality and youngest children being fun-loving and whatnot.
And agreeable.
And agreeable, exactly.
We all know you're not fun-loving and agreeable. It's pretty clear.
No, it's not, Stu. Anyway, but one thing that the researchers did stumble upon while they were looking for effects in personality is that on average, firstborns score higher on intelligence testing than their siblings. So on average, they have a higher IQ than their younger siblings. Now, as a thirdborn, naturally this comes as a surprise to me. I mean, it's a bit weird, right? Like, why would that be the case? Why would the eldest in your family, on average, be smarter than the rest of the family?
I have no idea.
No, it seems very, very, very strange. The researchers suggest, they have a couple of suggestions, which I'm not quite sure, but one could be the effect of parents giving more attention or lavishing attention onto the firstborn child.
Because there's less distractions.
Because there's less distractions and, and they really want to do it right the first time. They've got a lot more attention, a lot more time to give. And the other reason that they were thinking is maybe the eldest child helps the younger siblings with their work. As they grow up, they might be teaching them things and that reinforces their own learning. So the eldest children learn the first time and then they get to reinforce that learning a second or a third time with every younger sibling.
Did they compare only children with the oldest of a group of siblings? Because
that I'm not quite sure about.
Because that would be an interesting comparison to see if the actual having of the siblings makes them get higher IQ scores.
Yeah.
Rather than just that, an only child may not necessarily have that same IQ level.
That's a really good point. So the singletons or the only children could be the control group in that situation. Yeah, that might be a part of like some sort of research that they could do next. Future studies, absolutely. I sort of like the second way of looking at it in that it was all of your younger siblings that made you, oldest child, be the smarter person that you are, because that's sort of, the only reason your older siblings are scoring better is because of you.
Because they're standing on the shoulders of younger children.
That's it.
That's how it works. But also, I guess, you get more responsibility as the oldest child as well. So your parents sort of go, hey, you look after the other kids.
Yeah.
So you sort of have to...
You have to step up earlier.
Step up a little bit.
Step up onto the shoulders of the tiny siblings.
You're traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. That's the signpost up ahead. Your next stop...
Lost in Science.
All right, you are listening to Lost in Science. My name is Chris, and today I'm talking to Maura O'Connor, who is the author of a new book, Resurrection Science, which looks at the science and ethics of bringing species back from extinction. Now, this is a topic that a lot of people, of course, are very interested in. But first of all, can you just tell me, how did you get interested in it? What got you started on this particular journey?
Sure. I actually didn't start out being interested in de-extinction. I got interested in a really obscure toad from Tanzania that was in a captive breeding program in the Bronx Zoo. And that was sort of probably my most serious sort of exposure to conservation. And it just so happens that in the last, could say even 5 years, that there's been sort of these technological advances that seem like they could have applications in this de-extinction arena. So one of the ones that I think is really interesting is the fact that we can now take skin tissue, skin cells that have been preserved and sort of reprogram them into an immature state. So before this was possible, it would have been sort of inconceivable that we could take stem cells from an endangered species. That just wouldn't have really been possible when you're talking about animals of which there may be only dozens or even less. Having access to stem cells in order to try and possibly create new animals in a laboratory wouldn't be possible. But now with what's called induced pluripotent stem cells, all you need is skin tissue in order to possibly create sperm and eggs that could then be used to create new animals through in vitro fertilization. So there's some talk that may be happening in the near future with northern white rhinos. The other technology that has really been talked about in terms of de-extinction is CRISPR-Cas9, this genomic editing tool that I kind of think of it as how you can copy and paste in a Word document, but we, or scientists rather, not myself personally, can now do that with DNA. And the idea is that if you don't have enough preserved tissue from an extinct animal, as long as you had sort of a map of their genome and understood the differences between them and a near living relative, you could actually edit the DNA of that living relative and sort of recreate a genetically modified organism that ideally would replicate the original species.
Okay, wow, that sounds fairly impressive. So what species is these kind of techniques going to be used on? You mentioned the northern white rhino. What are they doing with that?
Well, right now with the northern white rhino, they've created induced pluripotent stem cells, but they're just in a freezer. It was the first endangered animal that they were able to do this with. Usually iPSCs, as they're called, are used in the field of regenerative medicine, so there's a lot of experimentation and research going into how could you use these for Parkinson's disease patients or Alzheimer's. So with the northern white rhinos, it's probably still a long ways off before they really use these frozen cell lines, but they do have the intention of doing so. They just need the funding and sort of the ability to restart those experiments. And there's only, I think, 7 northern white rhinos alive, so the timing couldn't be more sort of critical. And then with CRISPR-Cas9, there's talk that this could be applied to passenger pigeons. That seems to be the case that is furthest along to my knowledge, although I think there's also some idea that this could be used in woolly mammoth resurrection, that you could actually edit DNA from Asian elephants and sort of create elephants that could survive in the Arctic. And I just want to make clear that all of these are very sort of early stages. What I think is interesting is that it's being talked about at all, and I think it's no coincidence that obviously it's because the technology has advanced, but it's also because we're at a time in history when we seem to be losing many species, and there's a lot of sort of fear and guilt and, a lot of people who wish that wasn't actually happening and that we could undo some of the things that have happened in the past.
If people use these techniques, though, to resurrect these animals, do they have any idea where they'll put them if they've gone extinct because their habitat is destroyed?
Yeah, so that is a really important question. I mean, there's talk that, I'm a little bit vague on the details, but there is a guy in Russia who sort of has set aside land that you could possibly introduce these so-called woolly mammoths. And in terms of the United States, where I'm from, with passenger pigeons, there's some talk that you could use private lands to bring them back in small populations and then have them grow. But, I mean, those kinds of details have not been fully fleshed out. or debated, because I think it will be a very big debate. I mean, in the United States, we have many private landowners who do not want, endangered species on their property, because then they have to be regulated by the federal government. It's usually a huge headache. And so it's sort of hard for me to imagine that many people would welcome these species back into our landscapes at a time when we don't really know how to live with other critically endangered species and give them the space that they need. But having said that, one of the individuals who's sort of committed himself to passenger pigeon resurrection is this Ben Novak, who's profiled in the book. And he told me that he has gotten many letters from people who are eager to have passenger pigeons and to be part of this comeback of this amazing bird back into 21st century America.
Well, I guess a little bit closer to home, the one that everyone in Australia thinks about is the thylacine or Tasmanian tiger. Now, some people still think that it exists somewhere in the wilds of Tasmania, which seems to suggest that there may be enough habitat for it there. So is that more a feasible one in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, the thylacine issue has this really interesting history here in Australia. There's this initiative in the 1990s out of the Australia Museum to bring back thylacines through cloning, which turned out to be technologically impossible. I can't necessarily make an argument that that's a worthwhile endeavor from an ecological standpoint. Is it a good idea to bring back what was a top predator into the landscape? It may be that it has positive benefits in the same way that ecologists now believe wolves play a really important role and benefit, a lot of other species in the wild. What I think is, again, more interesting is why are we talking about this now? Like, what is it about thylacines? What do they represent? What do they symbolize to modern Australians? And why might they want to see them again or reject them like they did in the early 20th century as sort of pests and not compatible with modern society? Those seem to be questions that are really important that we ask ourselves, because certainly we're sort of facing the likelihood that extinction rates are going to increase and have already increased and are going to increase even more. And I think this concept of, or rather this issue of how can we coexist with wild animals and wild things is very relevant at this moment.
It is certainly a debate that you hear a lot. Do you think that has any benefits for the wider than conservation movement, or is it something that is a distraction?
Oh, yeah. Well, I do think that there's a lot of skepticism whether de-extinction should really be spoken about or considered a conservation tool, or whether it's something completely different. It's just a sort of fascinating experiment and a test of our technological powers. In the book, most of the conservation biologists I spoke to, even if they expressed a personal theoretical desire to see these animals, because who wouldn't, want in theory to see a woolly mammoth if they could, or, that would be an incredible experience. I don't think they saw it as very relative to the work that they do to try and preserve populations of rare animals. And in fact, one told me that he found it to be an offensive conversation. And there's a sense that there's a public fascination with this idea, and the media knows that. And so there's maybe some element of trying to capitalize on that fascination, whereas it doesn't necessarily represent the trajectory of the conservation community. But having said that, I do think that conservation biologists are increasingly having to use genetics and genetic technology, or at least an understanding of genetics in order to save these species. And so, like I said earlier, I do see it as sort of on a spectrum of tools that are available to biologists today, even though it's on a very, very far extreme end of the spectrum.
Okay, I guess it's all ultimately about saving the natural world that we're doing so much to destroy at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's about what kind of future we want to be living in. Conservation biology to me is so interesting. I'm not trained in it, but as a journalist coming to it, I started to realize over the course of writing the book that, this is a discipline that's based on science, but it's actually all about value judgments. It's more like a religion. Which species do we want to live with, and why should we care about them? There's no necessarily any empirical data to tell us the answers to those questions. It's rooted in sort of our vision of the future and our own moral convictions. And so to me, it's an extremely fascinating field where you see, science being served to carry forth those convictions and the convictions of a community and then the broader community too, which includes us, even if we're not out there on the front lines.
Excellent. Thank you very much for talking to us, Maura. Maura's book is Resurrection Science, available in all good bookstores. Yeah, thanks for talking to Lost in Science.
Oh, thanks so much. This was really great. I appreciate the support and thanks.
That's all we've got time for on this episode of Lost in Science. Thanks for tuning in and joining us. Lost in Science is recorded at the studios of 3CR in Melbourne and broadcast across Australia on the Community Radio Network with the financial assistance of the Community Broadcasting Foundation. If you want to talk to us, talk back to us, you can get in touch. We have a Gmail account, lostinsci@gmail. You can also find us on Twitter and on the Facebook. And if that's not enough Lost in Science for you, you can always tune in again next week, where the team will once again get Lost in Science!
Thanks for listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online.